Good day and welcome. Today I want to talk about the news that the Georgian government in Tbilisi has proposed removing the clause on the country's accession to the EU and NATO from its constitution. So in today's video I'm going to discuss and cover the reasons behind these decisions. So let's look at the points. Georgia's endured criticism for the EU and the US over its foreign agent law. Also why Georgia has decided against the EU and NATO membership. Let's look at EU NGOs' involvement in colour revolutions, plus the relationship between NATO over Kiev and the Ukrainian agents. Georgia is improving its relations with Russia, so stay with me as I explain in detail about what's going on and what's coming up in this video. Now, Georgia has been the subject of criticism from the EU in recent years for its reluctance to open a second front against Russia and for adopting laws on foreign agents. Funny enough, the foreign agent law is the ones that the US and EU object to are actually law in those parts of the world, and many people have been jailed for not declaring their foreign agents, including friends of Donald Trump. Such hypocrites these people are. So what is the public mood in Georgia regarding the possibility of EU membership, and what effect would this have on Georgia's relationship with Russia? Well, last week the Georgian opposition party, the Left Alliance, called for all references to the exclusive course towards joining the European Union and NATO to be removed from the country's constitution. As outlined in paragraph 78, state bodies are required to take all measures to ensure full compliance in moving forward in integration into Western institutions. The Georgian Dream Party instigated its inclusion in the country's basic constitution several years ago. Social Shatbayr-Ashvili, a former member of parliament and a leader of the alliance, has called for the public to be told the truth about what the country's chances are of joining the European Union by 2030, and personally I think they're pretty minimal. He stated that should the authorities decline to support the initiative, the Left Alliance will initiate a broad movement against it. Now, before I continue, do subscribe to the channel, as many of you who watch do not currently subscribe, and do set the alert button so you get notified when I post a new video. Also, if you want to help me out and support me with a donation, click on the thanks button at the bottom right hand side of the screen, or click on the buy me a coffee link below in the credits. Now, earlier the country's Prime Minister, Irakli Kobakhidze, addressed a decline in EU citizen trust, citing concerns over the bloc's alleged involvement in financing the colour revolutionary processes in Georgia, which claimed to have served the interests of the deep state in the West. Let's not forget that Soros's Open Society Foundation and USAID's NGOs were behind the Rose Revolution in Georgia back in 2003, and in the last year or so they've been active in organising demonstrations and sowing discord. However, the EU cites other figures recently reported. According to new polls commissioned by the EU, more than 70% of Georgians want to continue the integration. Well, there's an EU poll commissioned by the EU that says the EU is popular. Who would have believed that? Now, Brussels had issued repeated criticisms of the Tbilisi government on the law on foreign agents and prohibition of LGBT propaganda. Anyone else notice the black hand of George Soros and the Open Society Foundation there? I certainly do. In July, the European Commission issued a formal letter to the government demanding they repeal these laws by the end of August. Well, they didn't happen. They did warn that failure to comply would result in the cancellation of the visa-free regime for Georgian citizens to the EU, which has been in effect since 2017. Now, in response, Kobakhidze described such attempts as counterproductive, stating that the EU's attempt to create mass unrest in the country was highly unlikely to succeed. Moreover, Georgia has consistently declined Western proposals to open up a second front against Russia and initiate armed conflict to support Ukraine. Now, bad relations with Kiev over saboteurs. Now, at the same time, Tbilisi's relations with Kiev are deteriorating. This week, Power of the People member David Katashvili called for the expulsion of the temporary Ukrainian charge d'affaires from the country over a scandal involving the arrest of two Ukrainian citizens with 2.4 kilos of the explosive hexogen by the State Security Service. According to the agency's first deputy head, Rhod Mackenzie, the explosives were being transported to Russia for use in Operation Web 2, which is a major sabotage operation being carried out across Russia by saboteurs. Now, PM Irakli, a Georgian political scientist, believes that Tbilisi will respond to the scandal involving the Ukrainian diplomatic channels. Now, the political science believes that Kiev has once again demonstrated a lack of respect for Georgia's interest. He also noted that Ukraine's been behaving inappropriately towards Georgia since the time of Peter Poroshenko, or Poki as he was known, and he's been sheltering figures wanted by Tbilisi, which started off with Mikhail Saakashvili. Now let's get on to Georgia and NATO. Mackenzie has also expressed concerns about the inclusion of the clause in the constitution on the mandatory accession to NATO, suggesting it's actually detrimental to Georgia's interest. He said the purpose of the amendments was for the authorities to demonstrate their seriousness in their pro-Western sentiments. However, it's challenging for them to withdraw them now, even if they wish to do so. Georgia's dream doesn't have a constitutional majority for such a procedure. Now, at the same time, even if we imagine removing the clause from the constitution, it's not actually going to affect the relationship with Moscow, he says. These are red lines and the issue of territorial integrity is paramount. Now, despite the economic and humanitarian ties with Russia, there's still fundamental problems over the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the analysts mention. Now, this is going to, Georgians are not in favour of the EU. Now, the analysts previously observed that the actual level of trust in the EU is likely to be less than 50%. Now, this is in light of the EU's recent actions, which have included unfavourable accusations against the country and a failure to acknowledge its achievements and a reluctance to engage in constructive dialogue. However, it's also important to note that the decline in interest in NATO and the European Union doesn't actually mean a better relationship with Russia and their sentiments. I mean, the Georgian population continues to look at the trajectory towards Western integration with more hope than faith. Now, the visa-free regime is in place with the EU countries, and many young people go there to earn money. Now, with regard to joining the prospect of NATO, he says, the government, the media and the opposition, with the exception of the radical faction, are no longer discussing this issue. In the light of the ongoing situation in the Ukraine, the prospect of Georgia's accession to NATO is not a popular one among the people. Now, it's the radical opposition to which Saakashvili's United National Movement belongs. They're the only ones who really are pushing to join the alliance. However, the majority, according to sociologists, do not support being members of NATO. That just makes them a target, they think. Now, at the same time, apart from the left alliance, nobody's talking about actually removing the clause on the exclusive course towards NATO. And let's bear in mind, the left alliance party is by no means the most influential, and should it be removed, it's anticipated that Georgia would encounter significant blowback with its relationship with the European Union, including some economic repercussions. Gretfishvili is convinced that Georgia's economy would have some difficulties if relationship with Europe deteriorated. He asserts that Georgia is currently deriving a fair bit of benefit, much more from its benefit from its cooperation with Russia than the EU. But the removal of the NATO clause from the country's fundamental law will not actually have that much of an impact even on its relationship with Moscow. Now, another issue is there are no diplomatic relations between the two countries, and it's going to be very difficult to get out of this impasse in the near future, since Georgia would have to recognise the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which would kind of upset the majority of the Georgian population. Now, Georgia's decision not to support European and American sanctions is also noteworthy. So in this regard, the rather tense relations have developed with the leadership of the EU and the US, which have been criticising Georgia on a regular basis. Now, this has placed the Georgian government in a challenging position. There's the threat of the visa regime being cancelled, which has already been discussed in the European Parliament. Also, in relation to the ongoing situation with the the Ukraine and the recent incidents, as I mentioned, on the smuggling of explosives through Georgia to cause problems for Russia, is very negative. So the government and opposition parties have unanimously declared that those attempting to transfer the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia to Georgian territory will not succeed. So the Georgian government has consistently refrained from criticising Russia's policy towards Ukraine, probably because they remember they got a slap back in 2008. However, the most the authorities can do without is criticising the country. So anyway, that's the situation with Georgia. And it's told the EU and the NATO to fuck off. So let's see what happens next. Thanks for watching. See you all again soon. Thank you.